Thank you all for coming tonight. It's going to be a real pleasure to talk with you about George Washington and about the 10 crucial days. Dave was talking about myths associated with the Constitution. There's a heck of a lot of mythology associated with the 10 crucial days also. And we'll make reference to some of that. It'll be important for you to be able to see this, and there's going to be maps and things like that. So make sure that you're close enough that you can focus on the words as well as the bigger pictures. If you need to move, it won't bother me if you move. Okay. Every event in history is the most important thing that ever happened, right? Okay? Every little town, whatever happened there, that was key to the bigger events going on. Okay? I'm a historian who believes that every day was important. If anything had gone different on any day during the Revolution, it would have been a different story completely. I didn't make up the term 10 crucial days, but I do believe they were crucial. That doesn't mean no other days were crucial, but these were a group of 10 days that were crucial. Starting December 25th and ending January 3rd. Washington crossing the Delaware, and Washington, you all know the Don Troiani painting of Washington at the Battle of Princeton. Now, to see why these were such crucial days, we have to take a look at what was going on December 25th in 1776. The map shows that for New Jersey, it's mostly red, which means British controlled. The blue areas are where there's Patriot, Continental, and militia soldiers. Looks like British are pretty much in control on December 25th. On January 3rd, there's the change in the map. Okay? That in and of itself ought to say this was a pretty important thing, to be that big a change in 10 days. It's never going to look like the map on the left again. The British are never going to occupy New Jersey like that again. Even though the Americans are going to be in New Jersey virtually the whole war. They're going to have troops there. And the British are going to be in New York and area for the rest of the war, but they're not going to be occupying New Jersey. So that's one reason why this is such a key time. It's the time of the American crisis. Everybody knows, these are the times that try men's souls. That's the beginning of the 10 crucial days. This was published on December 19th, just 4 or 5 days before the 10 crucial days start. So it's a description of what was going on in the war at that time. The war had been going on since April 19th, 1775. That's 20 months. That's a year and 8 months that the war has been going on. When they first formed the army in 1775, they thought it'd be a few months and the war would be over. Independence was declared on July 2nd. That's about 6 months, roughly, 5-6 months before the times that try men's souls. During August through December, 4 months before this, it had been nothing but defeats and retreats on the part of the Continental Army. And for the poor soldiers, it had been months of sporadic pay, if any, food, clothing, and equipment. The Army was in really bad shape, and I'll give you more about that later on. So, the Army has been defeated and retreat, and it's not in very good physical condition. These are the times that try men's souls. The British are convinced the war is going to be over in a couple of months. They don't have to do anything else. The Americans are just going to see the futility of this war. Even many of the Americans are convinced it may be over in just a couple of months. We haven't been able to do very well here. They're looking for something to change that. And who are they going to count on to do that? The guy that they're all criticizing at this point, Mr. Washington. So Washington is going to have to go to a public opinion poll, but the people just were losing faith in him. And by that I don't just mean your ordinary citizen out in his fields farming. I mean Washington's subordinate officers, high-ranking officers. They were losing faith in his ability to get this thing through. Most of the soldiers' enlistments were expiring on December 31st. And here it is December 25th, and things are going downhill very fast, and now they're going to lose the Army in a week. There had been a new Continental Army authorized that would have longer enlistments. They've pretty much figured out this isn't going to be a short war by this time. But enlistments into that new army are not going very fast. Nobody's jumping at the opportunity to get involved in the Continental Army when all it's been doing is getting defeated and retreating, and they can't feed them, and they can't pay them, and etc. Somehow we're going to have to be convinced that fighting under Washington is going to lead to ultimate victory. So how are we going to make them believe that? It becomes the question. The Army had started out at about 20,000 troops, now down to about 2,800, plus some militia. Just want to take a look at one regiment. This is a regiment that I studied for my most recent book. And the 16th Continental Regiment of Colonel Paul Dudley Sargent, formed in Massachusetts, I think is a very good example of what all regiments were like. It wasn't unusual in any way. And this is what its history had been over the past 7 months or so, from May to December. People in the regiment present and fit for duty from 331 down to 122. Okay. Per company, there's eight companies in each regiment. Went from about 42 down to 16. That's a captain, lieutenant, 2 lieutenants, an ensign, a couple sergeants, a couple corporals, and then a bunch of enlisted men. That makes up a company. The original idea was a company would be about 90 men, officers and enlisted. But you can see this is nowhere near that, even at the beginning of the thing. Notice the one thing that goes up in number: absent sick. Okay? Only 14 in May, 235 just before the 10 crucial days. So when we talk about the men not having shoes, there's a whole lot of other stuff going on too, along with that was really hurting things. Now, let's take a look at that previous couple of months, the New York campaign, the retreat across New Jersey, and then Washington collecting his troops, getting ready to cross on the 25th. Just very quickly, we started the Battle of Long Island on August 28th, the Battle of Harlem Heights on September 16th, which was the only nearly positive event that was going on there. It was something of a draw. The Continentals did show that they could kind of stand up to the British, even though they didn't win a tremendous victory or anything. And then at White Plains, kind of another standoff, but a little bit more favor of the British. Then on November 19th, Washington had crossed the Hudson and started his retreat across New Jersey. He was actually doing that not just to run away from the British, but to get to Philadelphia and protect Philadelphia, because that's where the head of the government was. So he cuts across, and the British under General Cornwallis follow him. Washington then gets to Trenton about December 2nd, And between December 2nd and 8th, he crosses the Delaware, not the famous crossing. Okay? It's going the other way. It's going from New Jersey to Pennsylvania. And it takes him a week, not overnight, because he's trying to get everything over to Pennsylvania, including equipment and men. Civilians are fleeing from New Jersey. New Jersey had pretty well shut down by this point. There was no patriot government operating in New Jersey. Nobody knew where Governor Livingston was even. One of my favorite stories is that I found a letter at one time addressed to Governor Livingston, and you know how when they folded the letter, they put the address on the back. It wasn't in a separate envelope. And the address on the letter was, to Governor Livingston or whoever. And there was no address, no location, okay? That's what New Jersey was in at that point. December 2nd, about the same time that Washington starts to cross the Delaware to Pennsylvania, General Lee, who had been left behind with about half of Washington's troops on the Hudson, finally comes across. You know, Washington's been after him to cross and join up with him, and General Lee believes he's better than Washington, so he's not going to obey. And he finally comes across, and about December the 8th, you know, just shortly after Lee starts across, the British finally get all the way down to Princeton and begin to threaten Trenton. Lee, you can see from the route that he took his army, he wasn't in a big hurry to go straight and fast. But as you can see, it almost looks like he wanted to attack the British, and he did. He wanted to kind of cut them off, you know, cut the tail of their movement off and that kind of thing. But then he said, I really can't do that. So then he got back on track and went to Morristown. I'm sorry, yeah. So then he went to Morristown, and he decided to hang out at a tavern overnight and got captured by the British. So General John Sullivan had to take over command of those couple thousand troops from him. Sullivan was much more favorable towards Washington and wanted really to help Washington. So he's not going to mess around. He's going to get across New Jersey, cross at eastern Pennsylvania on the Delaware, and then come down and join up by December 21st. Again, a couple of days before the 10 crucial days start. And he gets to the McConkey Ferry area. Now, people always wonder, why did Washington decide to attack Trenton on Christmas or the day after? Use 2 days to capture Trenton. Well, the British had occupied New Jersey, as I said, closed down the government. The Patriots were feeling unsupported. The Loyalists were feeling empowered and emboldened. And the Continental Congress wasn't waiting around. They went off to Baltimore to get out of the British way. Again, the times that try men's souls. Washington is really in a situation now in December when armies at that time generally kind of shut down for the season to go into winter quarters, regroup, get new shoes. By the way, one of the myths about the Battle of Trenton and all that is the Hessians also didn't have good shoes. The British also were hurting for shoes. The supply systems for all the armies had not been good. Do you realize that a soldier at that time basically went through 3 pairs of shoes a year? Okay, so shoes were a constant problem, not just, with Washington crossing the Delaware and getting footprints in the blood prints in the snow. So Washington is at the point, he knows that a lot of his officers are losing trust in him. He's got to do something. He can't just go into winter quarters. He can't just say, okay, I put the Delaware River between me and my enemy, now I'm just going to hunker down. One might think he wanted to go into winter quarters instead of keep moving, because when he crossed over at Trenton, he made sure that there was nothing left on the New Jersey side that could float. And not just at Trenton, but about 20, 30 miles north and south of Trenton. Any small boat, raft, whatever, big log, anything that the British might use to come across the river went over to Pennsylvania with his troops and were being guarded there. The only way the British could get across is if they waited for the river to freeze, and then they could walk across. And there was some fear that that would happen. But anyway, Washington really had to go back to New Jersey, and he had to go quick. He's going to lose his army in 6 days with the enlistments being up. So that's one reason he's going to attack Trenton as soon as he can. It's when Sullivan's troops and some troops coming down from Ticonderoga, a smaller group, got to him just 2 or 3 days before Christmas that he decided, now I've got enough troops that I can do this. So he went at the earliest opportunity. So here we are. Washington has about 2,400 Continentals. He should have had many couple thousand more if those regiments had all been up to size. But most of them were like the regiment that I showed you, really small. There was General Ewing across from Trenton with mostly New Jersey militiamen. Cadwalader was off Bristol with a combination of a couple of Continental regiments, New England regiments, and then also a bunch of Pennsylvania militia. They had been camped for about 2.5 weeks in Bucks County. Some were lucky enough to get into a barn or an abandoned house or some kind of a farm outbuilding, but many were in tents, although if they were short of shoes and short of clothing and short of supplies of all kinds, you can guess that tents was one of the things they were short of also, and they were. So a lot of them were just out in the open. Yeah, they could use some brush and things like that, but brush is very valuable for something else besides shelter. It's called cooking your food, or a fire to keep warm by, okay? Now, with Washington's troops huddling over in Pennsylvania, the Hessians were occupying Trenton. There were 3 regiments, plus a few other units. There was the Rahl Regiment under Colonel Johann Rahl, who was basically quartered in the middle of Trenton. When you think about leadership among the Hessians, when you're taking your army into a town, again, hoping for winter quarters, which these guys were, and you have to spread them out into all kinds of abandoned houses instead of in a big barracks or something like that, you're losing contact, you're losing conversation, you're losing information, you're losing all kinds of opportunity to speak and learn and help your men. They're not just in one place. That yellow marker down there is the Trenton Barracks, which you may have visited or know about. One of the big myths of the 10 Crucial Days, no Hessians were stationed in the barracks. They were all stationed in homes and churches and other such buildings. The von Lossberg Regiment was in the southern part of Trenton. The Kniefhausen Regiment was in the eastern part of Trenton, in the south part. And then you also had, I don't know if you guys know what Jaegers are. Hessian Jaegers were light infantry. They were basically recruited from hunters, from outdoors guys, They were really the physical kind of guys that could do things on their own, not have to just be shoulder to shoulder all the time. And they wore green uniforms. So there are about 50 of them that were out on the road, just about a mile from Trenton. There were also 2 artillery units. They were stationed at churches, appropriately, I guess. I don't know. For some reason, they were stationed at churches. There were also about 20 British dragoons. There were some red coats at Trenton. It was not just Hessians. These guys were basically there to provide messenger service. Okay, these are light cavalry. They're not organized to go into combat, to support in combat. They are basically information gatherers or information takers to other places, particularly Princeton, where there were British, or down to the Bordentown, Burlington, Mount Holly area, where there was another group of Hessians. There were posts at both ends of Trenton, although Colonel Rahl did not do much in terms of preparing Trenton for defense. The Hessians were so set for winter quarters, they even established a hospital. Okay. They had medical people with them. They're going to need them. In the barracks, that's where the Hessian families were. Anybody surprised the Hessians had families with them? Okay, you don't think about that, right? We don't talk about them much. We know of at least 2 kids that were born in the barracks during the 10 crucial days. We know that when the Hessians get captured, their wives go with them into captivity. There were also some loyalists. Remember, New Jersey, doesn't have a patriot government that's working anymore. A lot of those loyalists were so happy to have the Hessians there, they came into town to help them out. How do they help them out? Basically, by pointing out who the patriots are, so the Hessians can steal stuff from them and not feel bad about it, and maybe avoid stealing from the loyalists in town so that they don't get upset. So there's about 1,500 Hessian troops. How many did Washington have? Remember? Washington, had 3 sections. He had 2,400 all by himself, okay? Versus 1,500. It's a pretty good advantage. He only had those 2,400 against 1,500 because of Sullivan's arrival with all those extra troops. These Hessian troops, contrary to myth, are not partying in Trenton. This is not vacation time for the Hessians after the contest. They are fatigued, and there are many of them sick. Okay? The day of the Battle of Trenton, just get ahead a little bit, many of the officers had to get out of sick bed to lead their men at the Battle of Trenton. And their men were laid up also. The Hessians were in a position of honor. They were on the edge of the formation of the army. They were in a position of honor because they had done so well in those battles around New York, and especially at the capture of Fort Washington and a couple other, Harlem Heights, etc. So many people ask, why didn't Howe put British troops that spoke English, where they're going to be talking to people in Trenton who theoretically speak English? Okay? Well, he felt that if he didn't put the Hessians there, he was insulting them. Okay? So, he put them there. He also had no concern that the Americans were able to do anything. So he wasn't really worried about it. That was one of his big mistakes. His other mistakes were that he did not fortify anything around Trenton. He did not build any fortifications on the roads leading into Trenton, no redoubts, no small fortifications of any kind where his troops could gather to defend the town from the attacking Americans. And maybe the biggest mistake he didn't draw up a plan of where everybody should meet and what the routine would be to defend the town if it was attacked. He basically said to his officers, "Find me and we'll figure it out. We'll see how the attack is going and we'll figure out how to go against it." The Hessians did not expect to be attacked by a large army. They expected to be attacked by small forces of 50 or maybe 100 at the most, because all the weeks that they were at Trenton, from December the 8th up to the Christmas time, almost every day the Americans had crossed the Delaware in small numbers to harass Hessian outposts, Hessian patrols, etc. The Hessians felt it was still full war going on, not winter quarters. You can see by the arrows that I put up there, sorry about that, that the Americans crossed and recrossed the Delaware. The Hessians were taking casualties, by the way, okay, as were Americans to some degree. Down south, closer to Philadelphia, you had a Virginia general, Colonel Griffin, who had gathered together about 500 New Jersey militiamen, and they were causing all kinds of havoc for those Hessians that were south of Trenton under Von Donop. So the Americans were just nitpicking at these guys every day. They couldn't rest. They couldn't, get their strength back. They couldn't, recover from their illnesses, things like that. They literally, in at least one letter from one of Colonel Rawls' officers to his superior, he said, "It feels like we're still on campaign." So, while many people feel Washington attacked Trenton because the Hessians were celebrating and partying and getting drunk, no, they weren't. They were on duty expecting a light attack because it had happened every day. They had to be alert, those that were well enough to be alert. His plan of attack was to use his superior force, try to make it a surprise as much as possible, and overpower the enemy with artillery. I talk about leadership and really using your head on something here. Washington listened to people that he trusted. He would listen to very carefully. And one of the people that he trusted was Henry Knox. And I don't know that many people know this. You know that he was head of the Continental Artillery, but leading up to the Battle of Trenton, he had not achieved that high rank yet. He was not a general yet. He was a colonel. He wrote out during those couple of weeks when Washington was hanging out in Bucks County, Henry Knox wrote up a plan for the Continental Artillery that he would later be the head of. Washington was very impressed with Knox's work. Knox also told him, if you're going to attack Trenton, take a lot of artillery. They knew from checking with people who had been in and out of Trenton that the Hessians only had 6 artillery pieces, 6 cannon. So Washington decides to go 3-to-1. He's going to get 18 artillery pieces. He's going to be attacking the town of Trenton. With streets. It's going to be street fighting and stuff like that, not big wide open field fighting. He's going to have like bowling alleys that he's going to be able to shoot artillery down against the Hessians. And he's going to make multiple attacks, including some that will be diversion. He's going to cross at McConkey's Ferry. He's going to take Rhodes, it's about 9 miles or so, and he's going to split that group and attack Trenton from 2 sides. The upper part and the southern part. All the Hessians are going to be right in the middle. General Ewing is going to cross his troops at Trenton, just south of town, in order to prevent the Hessians from retreating out of town and heading down to join up with their buddies down by the Burlington area. Cadwalader is going to cross his troops around Bristol so that he can combine with some militia that General Putnam is going to send up from Philadelphia, and they are going to harass and either have a diversion against the Hessian troops down there to prevent them from going up to Trenton and helping out Von Roll, or they're going to go full attack with them. They are going to be in numbers, very close in numbers, so they could do that. That's the plan. So why did Washington cross at McConkey's Ferry? Some people would say because that's where the artist was. You know that the artist was German, and it was in the 1830s or so that he did the painting, and he was painting the Danube, not the Delaware. But why did he choose McConkey's Ferry? Everybody knows about the Durham boats, and he used Durham boats, no question. Durham boats go up and down the river, not across the river. That's the one problem, okay? They can literally go across the river anywhere. They're like a big canoe, pointy at both ends. They can just run up on the shore anywhere. And they can leave the shore from anywhere. He didn't need a ferry. He could have gone anywhere on the Delaware for Durham boats. What he needed was ferry boats. And that's why he chose a ferry. Let me ask you, how many artillery pieces is he going to get into a Durham boat? How many horses that pull the cannon are you going to get into a Durham boat? How many wagons of ammunition is he going to get into a Durham boat? None. Okay? He had to have the ferries in order to make this a successful engagement. Here's a photograph of the kind of boats that were used as ferry boats at that time. And you can see they're designed to carry wagons and horses very, very carefully. But you do have to use them at a ferry. They require some equipment. Okay. So anyway, that's why he crossed at a ferry. He crossed at the particular ferry, McConkey's Ferry and Johnson's Ferry, because he knew those ferry owners were both very strong patriots. He had some doubts about the ferry operators at some that were closer to Trenton. So that's one reason he chose McConkey's. It was also just far enough away that he didn't anticipate that the Hessians would be sending out many patrols that far. They might send one, or they probably wouldn't, though. So he was trying to stay a bit away. So the crossings then on December 25th, Washington is going to cross and gets across no problem, he says so easily. Compared to the other two, he had no problem. He had plenty of problems. General Ewing, notice his error was just a blob. He never even got across the river. Never made it. Too much ice. Cadwalader, notice I got him across before I put the stopping bubble there. And then he went back because he only got a few men across and he couldn't get his artillery across. One thing that people need to know about the Delaware River is Trenton is the head of navigation. Below Trenton towards Philadelphia, the river is tidal. It moves. It doesn't just flow in one direction. It'll flow back on itself a little bit, come down again. Above Trenton, where Washington crossed, it was always flowing in the same direction. So ice forms differently in tidal areas than it does on continuously flowing rivers. So while Washington had problems, Ewing and Cadwallader had horrible, horrible problems. Even Washington wouldn't have been able to get them across there. Putnam just decided he couldn't even try. He couldn't get enough militiamen to make it worth his while to cross. Cadwallader didn't get across, Ewing didn't get across. Washington was the only one. So the Battle of Trenton is just going to be those 2,400 guys of Washington against the Hessians. Ewing's guys can watch, from across the river. And Cadwallader's can wonder what the heck is going on upriver. Was Washington able to get across even though we weren't? What's happening here? So he comes across, he marches, he splits up, heads to Trenton, and I've shown there the two outposts of the British that he ran into on the two roads leading into Trenton. The dark blue line heading back to Trenton shows that those were Hessian Fusiliers who he pushed back to Trenton. They retreated. And the green line, those are those Jaegers that I was talking about, the huntsmen, in their green uniforms. He pushed them back into Trenton. I mean, you got almost 1,000 men against 50 at the most. They're going to get pushed back, no problem. And then the American troops are following them all the way to Trenton. In Trenton, where they run into Rawls' three regiments, they're going to come from basically these directions. That's going to be General Sullivan on the one arrow at the left with about half the troops. And the three arrows that you see up above, that's General Washington with Nathaniel Greene, and the other half of the troops are coming in there. So they've got the guys pinched. What are they supposed to do? They're supposed to find Rawls, right? And find out how are we going to deal with this. Well, that's going to be hard because these guys are pushing back on there. They're fighting them already. They can't get to Rawls. It's too complex. There's artillery firing down the streets at them. How are they going to get to anybody? The Hessians, the Jaegers, when they get chased back into town, they just escape. They don't even stand and fight. Now, I don't want to put too bad a thing on them. I think that what they did was, as you can see right there where their arrow is by Mill Hill, Mill Hill was a defensible area. It's one of the places that Rawls had been told he should build redoubts, or a redoubt. And that could be a place where he could stand off against an attack on the town. I think the Jaegers were going there, having been told, find me and we'll make a plan. They thought that's where Rawls was probably going to go. Rawls never got there. So they just, when they saw the battle was being lost, they just continued on down to Bordentown. Those 20 light cavalrymen, they skedaddled out of town as soon as the Americans started coming in. Again, their primary purpose was just communication. Again, they may have been heading to Mill Hill, thinking that that's where everybody was going to form up. But the battle takes place right in the main street of Trenton, and then Colonel Rawls and the Lossburg Regiment are forced just out of town into an apple orchard. And the Kniefhausen Regiment is also under attack from Sullivan's troops. Rawls gets mortally wounded. His troops surrender. They're completely surrounded. Now they can go down and take on the Kniefhausen, which is also still fighting Sullivan. And the troops from across the creek can use artillery, particularly on them. Their artillery piece, by the way, gets stuck in the mud with the Kniefhausen, and they can't really fire back with artillery. It's disabled. And so they surrendered. So now you got all three of those regiments surrendered, and several of the other units and all out of town. So after the battle, you've got those that left town going down towards Bordentown. You've got Washington and his prisoners heading back to the ferry crossing. And then the troops down in the Burlington area, even though Cadwalader didn't get across, they learn about the attack on Trenton. They learn about the defeat at Trenton from all these guys that are running out of town here, the ones that escaped. We don't hear too much about the ones that escaped. We hear about the ones that got captured, but we don't hear so much about the escapees. And they're all going to head up basically towards Princeton. So the whole area is getting cleared out. The next day or two, Washington sends his prisoners down to Philadelphia. Again, men, women, and children prisoners. Okay? Now, Washington's back in Pennsylvania. He's had a great victory, but he's got to go back to New Jersey. I don't know if people who travel, feel like I got to get back to New Jersey. But, Washington had to get back to New Jersey. He still had needs. He still had to get the British out. Okay, yeah, he got 900 Hessians out, but, thousands are still there. He has to convince his soldiers to extend their enlistments and join the new regiments that are being built to replace them. How's he going to do that if he just sits in Pennsylvania? He also, because of his victory at Trenton, a lot of New Jersey and Pennsylvania militiamen have come flocking to him, saying, how can we help? Well, you better give them something to help with, or they're going to get out of there. So he decides to concentrate his forces back in New Jersey, partly at Trenton and partly at Bordentown and Crosswicks. December 29, January 1st. This is right at the time when those guys are going to have to re-enlist. He's got a different army on December 29th than he has on January 1st. He's lost a lot of guys by January 1st, and he's gained new ones, who have come to join. He's lost a lot of Continentals. He's gained a lot of militia. So the professional quality of his army has changed a bit. Now, in order to get his Continental troops to re-enlist, it's a very interesting situation. Back a year before, on December 31st, 1775, he was in a very similar situation. He was facing the enemy at Boston, besieging them at Boston. And his army was disintegrating, and he was creating, a new one, getting enlistments in a new one. Now, he's facing the enemy in New Jersey, again, a reconstruction or remodeling of his army at the same time. They're in transition. The first establishment of the Continental Army had been what Washington found in Massachusetts in June of 1775. Then at the end of then after a few months, then they had done the second establishment, which was the one that was being put together in December of 75. Now he's transitioning from the second to the third establishment. Very similar situation. Enlistments in 1775 were going really slowly. Ditto. Troops were just leaving at the end of their enlistments rather than signing up for more duty. Ditto. Not all of them left. He was able to talk close to 50% of them to stay, but the others left. Does that mean the troops that left him were really just giving up on the war? Not at all. Not at all. Many of them joined their local militias. Many of them, after some time away from the Army, did re-enlist in one of those new regiments. So they weren't just giving up. But when you think about what they had been through, they needed to get away. Now, Washington kept telling them, if you stay with me for 6 weeks, forget a year or 2 year or 3 year enlistment, if you can just stay with me for 6 weeks, you can do more for your country than maybe at any other time. But I can't tell you what it is. Okay. Well, based on their experience, telling them they couldn't tell them what they were going to be doing. It wasn't going to be very enticing. So that really didn't help. One of my favorite stories concerns that 16th Regiment that I showed you the statistics on before. There was one man in that regiment whose name was Jacob Francis. He was a free black man from New Jersey who was fighting in a Continental Regiment. How he got that, you'll have to read the book. But at any rate, Jacob Francis was a 22-year-old man. He hadn't been back in New Jersey for over 10 years. He didn't know if his mother was still alive. He hadn't communicated with her for over 10 years. But at Trenton, he was only about 12, 15 miles from where he'd been born. He was born in Hunterdon County in Amwell Township, if you know that. He also was a black man in an army that was not overly friendly to black men at that time. Jacob Francis decided not to extend his enlistment. He wanted to find Mom. Because Mom knew something that he didn't know, that he wanted to find out. He wanted to know his family's last name. He had been bound out as an indentured servant as a young boy, and he didn't know his family name. He didn't know if he had who his father was. He had no siblings. It was just he and Mom in his life, and he didn't know her last name or his last name. He wanted to find out. Long story short, he found Mom, found his name, and he enlisted in the New Jersey militia, which he was required to do. All men in New Jersey were. And he fought very well the rest of the war in the New Jersey militia. He even added to the New Jersey militia because he was one of the few men in his particular company and regiment who had seen continental service and was a professional soldier to some degree. And, gone through 14 months of hell and back in the war. And he was able to transfer and use his skills to teach some of the white guys in his militia company, how to survive and things like that. So he was highly regarded in his militia unit. But anyway, every man who didn't extend basically had a story like that. It wasn't that they were just sick of things. They had things they wanted to do. You know the men who helped row Washington across the Delaware, the Marblehead Regiment? Everybody knows about the Marblehead. The Marblehead Regiment did not extend their enlistments. They went back to Massachusetts. They went back because, remember, a lot of these guys are seafarers. They went back to sign on to privateers and fight the British at sea rather than on land. They weren't giving up on the war. They were just giving up on being marched around in half bare feet and not getting fed enough. They'd rather be on a ship with a chance to make some really good money on a prize. So that's what was happening. So on January 1st, Washington has what's left of his army, or what has joined him, and the British right now are wanting revenge for Trenton. So they concentrate their troops at Princeton. Imagine the little town of Princeton, normally about 500 people or so, gets enlarged to almost 10,000. I would not have wanted to have lived in Princeton. Those troops all needed stuff. Washington decided to call his troops from Bordentown and Crosswicks. This is where Cadwalader and all those guys were. Get everybody at Trenton. And then on January 1st, he sent over 1,000 men up the main road between Trenton and Princeton and said, everywhere a creek crosses the road, and there's 4 or 5 of them, set up an ambush. Well, I don't want you to take on the British and get yourselves wiped out or anything like that. I just want you to delay them. So they have a problem at every creek crossing. They have to deploy their troops. They have to, go through all this, and that just slows them down. Because he said, you guys have got to keep them from getting to Trenton until late in the afternoon or even evening. To me, that sounds like he had a plan. Why did he tell these guys, be sure you conduct your harassment in such a way that the British will not get to Trenton until nearly dark? I mean, this is winter, it's going to be a short day. Did he just want to wait and have the British attack in at daylight and have a full day the next day? It just, in my mind, it just seems he must have had a plan. Well, here's what happened. On January 2nd, the British came to attack him. They came down the main road, and every hour or two, they ran into one of those ambushes. You can see the creeks there, I think, where these skirmishes took place. And they don't get to Trenton until about 5 o'clock, a winter 5 o'clock. And the Americans are all in that blue section across a barrier, the Assunpink Creek, which has just one bridge across it in the Trenton area. A big stone bridge, and you can see that in the picture in the right-hand corner. Washington has a lot more than 18 artillery pieces here. He's got 30-some. And he can bombard the British as they are coming into Trenton. However, even though the British try to cross on that bridge and lose a lot of guys, it's not time to fight a battle in the dark. So Cornwallis calls things off, and both sides kind of go into camp for the night. Get some dinner, put out, make a bedroll of some kind. It's only January, enjoy being out, So the Americans and the British just go into their overnight quarters, expecting to fight at dawn the next day. Washington holds a council of war at a house just outside of Trenton, the Douglas House, which still stands and still is like in the park. It's not on the same spot where Washington met. It's on a spot now that would have been right in the middle of the British forces, okay, which I don't think he would have had a council of war at there. It's actually been moved 3 times in its history, but it's now in a park to be preserved and everything like that. But, the story of that conference is that Washington was talked into what he was going to do against Princeton the next day. It's my humble opinion that Washington had a council of war and had talked enough with his officers in the days ahead of time to run the council in such a way that they all thought they came up with the idea. Several of them in their memoirs claim to have had the idea that Washington used. Washington was brilliant when it came to dealing with his officers and getting everybody to join in, on whatever the plan was. So now it gets to be midnight and the armies are still encamped. Washington sends the word around that we're going to head to Princeton. have a night march to Princeton. I'm sure his guys were real happy about that after fighting the British all day, you know, and then finally getting to sleep at night. Now we've got to get up and march again. So they marched all night, and they got to a intersection of two roads. And what I've shown you on the right there is a map, sometimes called the spy map, that you might have heard of. And this was made a couple of days before January 2nd. And it was a drawing of the town of Princeton and how the British troops there had established defensive positions, you know, artillery emplacements, etc. And gave Washington an idea of how he could successfully attack Princeton. So what he decided to do was to divide his forces there. He was good at dividing forces. You notice that Trenton and Princeton, and January 2nd, he had guys here and there. He wanted to go around Princeton in that direction and then go up a road that was he was told was a non-used road. It went to a grist mill. It wasn't a real public road that would have had a lot of traffic. And the British weren't really putting guard posts on it. So he'd be able to get up behind Princeton by using that road. He was going to break off from that group so that he'd have a third group that would be right at the center of Princeton. So he'd hit Princeton right at the front and on both sides. If you know where Nassau Hall is, Princeton University, that's where these last arrows wind up, because that's where most of the British troops were at Nassau Hall. Now, Washington knew that there were only maybe 1,500 British troops in Princeton. All the rest had gone down to Trenton, all those other thousands and thousands. 1,500. Sounds like Trenton again, huh? Okay. Only this time he doesn't have 2,400 guys, he's got more like 5,000. He really outnumbers these guys. Okay. So that's what he's expecting, to surround these guys, and he's going to deal with these guys easy. And meanwhile, Cornwallis is going to be sitting down in Trenton wondering where the heck he is. Well, what actually happens is very different. You know what they say about the best laid plans, you know, they just never work out. Okay, that's where they're starting from. That's that intersection that was on the other map. Washington does send the troops that are going to go to the outside of Princeton, the far side. But he doesn't realize that Lieutenant Colonel Mahood, who was in charge of those 1,500 troops in Princeton, had gotten orders from Cornwallis the night before to leave a couple of hundred of them there, and the rest of them march down to Trenton to help him out and to bring a lot of supplies and things. So Mahood is leaving right about dawn, just as Washington, right about dawn, is getting ready to attack Princeton. Now it looks like they're close here, but they cannot see each other. They're totally out of eyesight of each other. Now, to just move ahead a little time, Washington is heading up that back road, that Sawmill Road, and his other troops are getting in position on the far side of Princeton. And Lieutenant Colonel Mahood is still heading down towards Trenton. So they're still marching on their roads. And again, they're about a mile apart. Have no idea. Okay. They could have easily just bypassed each other and never had a battle or anything, except that the sun was coming up, and the sun likes to sparkle off of metal. Do armies have metal? Fair amount, okay. And the sun glinted in such a way that the British, who at that point were on high ground, they're top of a hill, and Princeton was such an agricultural area, there weren't a lot of trees like there are today around there. They could see a mile away, hey, there's some guys there, and the sun is glinting off their metal. And the Americans kind of got hit in the eye, and they looked up, and they saw like a British cavalryman with metal, or with the sun glinting off his metal. And so they look at each other now, what's going on here? The British are supposed to be in Princeton, the Americans are supposed to be in Trenton. So both officers are wondering what to do. I would not have wanted to be Lieutenant Colonel Mahood. He's got the decision. Do I just keep going and follow my orders from General Cornwallis? I mean, following Cornwallis's orders was a pretty smart thing to do. Okay. Or do I try to find out who those guys are? Well, he finally decided he better find out who they are. So, both he and Washington are continuing towards Princeton. Washington sends General Hugh Mercer with several hundred troops across some farms, because when they saw those troops on that hill as cavalry, they thought it was like a morning patrol. You know, maybe 20 guys, but probably less. Okay? So he's going to send a couple hundred guys over to find that patrol. Mahood continues, but he wants to find out who these guys are, so he personally leads his 17th Regiment of Foot, which was not really complete at this point, and also some odds and ends of other units that he had with him. He really had a pile of different kinds of troops at Princeton, and a lot of them were going to Trenton to meet up with their full units or their parent units. So he took some of those, and they cut across the farms to find out. Of course, they run into each other when they can finally see each other, which is about the time they run into each other. And much of the fighting is going to take place. If you've ever been to Princeton Battlefield State Park, that's right where those two arrows are meeting there. Okay? And the Americans are not doing too well, because the British have something that Mercer's troops don't really have a lot of, and that's bayonets. And so they're discouraging the troops. But it's just going back and forth. And again, British troops are heading back into Princeton, and Washington continues on towards Princeton until he gets the word it isn't going so well down in our battle. So Washington, and here's the leadership story of the day, he takes two battalions of New England troops, New England and Pennsylvania, and he doesn't say, hey boys, go down and help out. We're going on to Princeton. He says, follow me, boys. He leads them into the battle on the British left flank. So the British are being attacked from the front and the left flank. And then some of Washington's troops that he had delayed but then sent out to tear down a bridge so that the British coming up from Trenton would not be able to use that road real effectively. And some of those troops peeled off and attacked the British on their right flank. So now the British are getting hit from three sides, and they are vastly outnumbered. Vastly outnumbered. And getting hit from three sides. Here's the painting again, okay? Washington on his horse. Several of Washington's troops put their hat over their eyes when they saw Washington. Not because they didn't want to see him. Well, they didn't want to see him. They're afraid he's going to get killed. They didn't want to see him get killed, because he's right in between the two armies shooting at each other. Washington had many things that helped him, and a lot of it was his intelligence, a lot of it was his leadership abilities, and all of that. But another part of it was luck. None of those bullets hit him. Didn't get a scratch. But boy, did he make an impression on his guys. Okay. So now, they're finishing up the British down where the battlefield is, and the British are coming out of Princeton as well as going to Princeton. The Americans that didn't go with Washington to the main battle keep heading towards Princeton. The British set up a defense at a little place called Frog Hollow, a creek and a ditch there and whatnot. Today it's part of a golf course in Princeton. And the Americans continued on to there, fought the Battle of Frog Hollow, which was just a little skirmish involved with the Battle of Princeton, and forced the British to retreat. Here you got a couple hundred guys and you got a couple thousand guys coming out. So now the Americans could just go into Princeton, no problem, and do the mop-up. After that, the Americans head on to, the British head on to Brunswick and to their territory, and the Americans head up to Morristown. And they're going to go into winter quarters at Morristown. But again, notice how the map has changed from what it was on December 25th. And like I say, on that January 3rd plus, British aren't going to come back and take over New Jersey again. So that was pretty important. The British commented, Lord George Germain commented to Parliament that everything looked really great in December of 1776. We're going to win. But all our hopes were blasted by that unhappy affair at Trenton. And then the 10 days after, the 9 days after. And this I love. The people of Annapolis made a presentation to Washington, made a proclamation to Washington. And this, notice the date, it's December 1781. Okay? A few years after the 10 crucial days. And in this address to Washington, they say, the successes at Trenton and Princeton laid the cornerstone of our freedom and independence. The capture of Earl Cornwallis and his army, which was just a couple months before December, has completed the edifice and secured the Temple of Liberty to us and our posterity. And then, these brilliant and important events are the more agreeable to every American from the reflection that they are were planned by and executed under the immediate command of Your Excellency. So that's the 10 crucial days and their importance. And I've written several books that get into the 10 crucial days. All of those books, all 5 of them, deal one way or another. And of course, one of them focuses entirely on the 10 crucial days. But that's what I have to tell you.